Servile insurrection. What is it? What does it do? And why? Why is it important on Black History Month? Slave rebellions. From the sensational Haitian Revolution of the 1800s to the lesser remembered Zanj Rebellion of the 800s. Enslaved Africans fighting back against their oppressors is a tale as old and venerable as time itself. Unfortunately, what history has taught us about slave revolts is that historians sure don't want us to remember that the slaves ever thought to rebel. From ancient Rome's conspicuously sparse records on the subject, to the modern era's informational difficulties when it comes to the subject. This ought to tip all of you off to the topic being vastly richer and more interesting than you had previously anticipated. People rarely bother politicizing or erasing histories that are boring or vanilla, harmless. No, rather, there's a lot to see here. The history of the African diaspora alone is thick with these small acts of rebellion, dotted with grand flashes of revolution, some of them more successful and sensational than you might think. And unfortunately, that's the biggest problem with this video. The topic is just too damn big. We talked in the last video about the scope of slavery, and that has been a huge problem for me. You see, it's hard to get sources on anything that happened in, say, the Arab world if you don't speak Arabic and also have access to a lot of records in history that are just not available for me to investigate. And that's not even getting into Indian history or the history of Southeast Asia. As a result, even though I know for a fact slavery was pretty common in the Arab world, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and even as far as China, I don't really have a lot of good examples of full-on slave uprisings in those areas. Now, that's not to say that they didn't happen. I know for a fact that European colonizers in the East Indies didn't run such a tight ship that no one ever rose up in defiance. Quite the contrary. More likely, acts of defiance from African populations simply didn't get recorded and preserved quite as well as I would have liked. This can be seen in American history. I talked about the small acts of rebellion, the little things. You see, people record the big, flashy events. You know, the 1811 German Coast Uprising, the Haitian Revolution, or the Malay Revolt of Brazil in this year that I have on the screen. That I didn't forget. I just choose to not discuss it or any of its previous revolts. Yet. I mean, I made a list of them in preparation for this video, just on the one page. Yeah, you've got Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, the Stono rebellion of, I want to say, Virginia in 1741, the New York City Revolt in 1712, the New York City Conspiracy in 1741, the Cherokee Slave Revolt of 1842, and don't even get me started on the Black Seminoles, Seminoles, who fought in the Florida War. These uprisings and the people who participated in them are fundamental parts of American history that rarely get discussed. I mean, look at this list of just the rebellions that I've mentioned. Each one of them is a pretty significant historical slave revolt. And yet, I'm willing to bet that there's more than one of them on this list that you simply haven't heard of. I know I never learned about any of these when I was in school. In fact, there's a handful on this list that I didn't learn about until I was researching for this video. So, where am I going with all this? Here's where I'm going with all this, I answered myself, as though talking to Mirror Me. Hello, Mirror Me. Hello, normal me. I can't teach you all about African slave uprisings in one video. I would struggle to do it in dozens of videos. Honestly, I would struggle a lot. I'm pretty dumb. But what I can do is help you to understand how these uprisings came together and how they were important in preserving African culture and identity moving forward. Okay, to start off, I want to clarify a couple of things. First off, not every act of defiance is a big, violent clash. American history alone is fraught with these, but what people often forget are the little things. The efforts of African parents, religious figures, and teachers are not to be understated in their role as preservers of African culture. Enslavers of a European cultural background would have gladly erased the entirety of African culture, the whole memory of it, from religion to history to ethnic cohesion. And in many cases, they succeeded at this. But in many others, they failed. The reason for this being that crushing slaves into obedience is actually a pretty expensive affair, especially considering slaves quite frequently outnumbered their enslavers in the US on a region-to-region basis. We owe a lot as Americans and as historians to the sacrifices of people who never took up arms against their oppressors in this country. And while it's important not to forget the people who made bloody, brutal sacrifices in the name of freedom, it's also very important to remember the people who made more personal sacrifices. People who preserved their culture, often behind the backs of those who enslaved and oppressed them. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, what is it that brings slave rebellions together? I would argue you could break it down into two things: cohesion and solidarity. A good example of the importance of this cohesion and how it works would be the presence of Islamic slaves from West Africa in the New World. The strongest example of this would be in Brazil. As a matter of fact, there's a pretty decent presentation you can find on the Mali Revolt and Brazilian Muslims in general, done by Margarita Rosa at the 16th Muslim American Society and ICNA convention. While normally I would steer any historian away from any form of heavy religious bias, Margarita Rosa's research on the topic seems legit and does not exist in a purely religious vacuum by any means. Furthermore, her perspective really helps bring light to why the background of these rebellions is so important. It helps us to understand what enslaved Africans stood to lose when we see our shared values and beliefs stripped from them. Or at least values and beliefs we, as modern humans, can understand. You see, West Africans in Brazil made pretty big sacrifices to preserve their Islamic faith in many cases. This brought them together for one spectacular uprising, which can be characterized nearly wholesale by this Islamic aspect to it. It took centuries for Islam to be more or less stomped out in Brazil, their culture erased. They had to remove literacy from these people for generations on generations to erase the memory of their past. My point here being that many people remember the flash in the pan Malay uprising, but few remember the simple act of defiance that is continuing to go to church and learn scripture even as your identity is stripped from you and erased. This is the first important aspect of slave uprising: cohesion. There haven't been a lot of slave revolts that I've read about personally that lacked this sort of cultural identity at its core. It is almost distressingly common when you look at these slave revolts to find that they took a bunch of experienced soldiers and warriors, usually from the same tribe or cultural identity, enslaved them all in one place, often along with individuals groomed for leadership, African royals or nobility or even generals, etc., and then expected these people not to come together and revolt. It's not always a religious cohesion. A lot of times it's a cultural cohesion. And that brings us to our second aspect of all these slave revolts. The one cohesive movement is never the entirety of the movement. In fact, the Stono Rebellion, actually, fam, I was thinking of the conspiracy fostered by Denmark Vesey in 1822. Both the Stono Rebellion and Vesey's conspiracy occurred in South Carolina, which explains the confusion. However, as far as I can tell, the Stono Rebellion did not involve any individuals that were not slaves. Stono Rebellion is still a good example of what I'm talking about, however. As well, many of the slaves who revolted were Catholics from the Congo region of Africa, which would have brought a lot of them together culturally. These Congolese Christians were, of course, by no means the only demographic which participated in the Stono Rebellion. Also, Jemmy Cato and Denmark Vesey are both men of notable literacy and intelligence, which is probably how I swapped them up and got confused. The point stands, though. Back to the show. Was one such endeavor where it was organized by not just enslaved individuals, but freedmen, because they understood something that many people in today's society seem to sort of forget. They form these sort of internet cliques or ideological cliques, and they forget solidarity. None of these fights, these revolutions you read about in the past, whether they be slave revolutions or later workers' revolutions, civil revolt, civic uprising, in the cause of unions and labor. Battles fought long and hard for the workers' rights that we take for granted almost as much as we take our basic equalities and freedoms for granted. These people set aside many of their differences in the pursuit of freedom and liberty. It's sad to me that people have forgotten about slave rebellions. So many of them simply erased. Many of the tiny acts of rebellion. Many pirates from the golden age of piracy were black. And yet very, very few of the individuals we remember from that time, that we glorify from that period, are black. Because those individuals were erased. Not because they didn't exist. And you see something similar happening with these uprisings. These revolutions, in my mind, are about as American as apple pie. There's nothing more American than fighting for your own freedoms, than sacrificing for the independence, for the liberties of the people that you love. As for solidarity, it's important. I've spoken to members of my family who don't understand why people come from a lot of different perspectives and join each other for movements like Antifa or Black Lives Matter, where if you were to ask each individual person what the movement meant or why they're out there on the street, they'd give a different reason. But I would say what these people don't understand is everybody's got their own perspective, and you're never going to get enough people together to make a change if your cause doesn't benefit more than one perspective. If you look at most of the slave rebellions that I mentioned earlier in the video especially, you'll find that freedmen, even multi-generational freedmen, often fought alongside the enslaved. And if you look at situations like the Malay revolts or revolts in Brazil, or even the Zanj rebellion, you'll find that it wasn't just enslaved Africans fighting for their own interest. Other enslaved or oppressed populations came out to fight for freedom as well. The pursuit of freedom and liberty isn't a game just for the people on the bottom of the societal bracket. There's a reason when you look at revolts like the Malay Revolt or the 1811 Slave Rebellion, you'll find culturally unifying factors that create a big cohesive block But people outside of that bloc would still step in to fight for freedom and liberty. The point being, just because you're not a slave toiling in the fields or a worker forced to work obscene hours in unconscionable conditions, doesn't mean that you're not oppressed or that you're not working in insufficient conditions. The people who fought and died in these slave rebellions understood that for the most part. They were willing to come together and sacrifice their own personal interests for the greater good. Now, it's also worth mentioning, with a lot of these slave rebellions, what ended up undoing a bunch of them, what ended up sort of leading them to their downfalls, was some people didn't feel this way. There were enslaved individuals, freedmen, etc., who would participate in the conspiracies and then, for their own personal gain, rat them out to the authorities. There are slave rebellions that were a few rolls of the dice, a few matters of chance away from being massively successful. That's not to say a lot of these slave rebellions, even if they were at the peak of their success, wouldn't have ultimately failed. You're talking about a pretty small force against a pretty monolithic interest, right? Slavery was a massive industry, and it benefited people to push back against equality and freedom. It's why they did it for decades to centuries. It's why after slavery was abolished in the South, many of the states used the prison system to imprison people for similar labor by applying vagrancy and unemployment laws exclusively to people of color, and then putting those people to work in shitty factory conditions. All right, to wrap things up, the reason I think it's important that we understand these aspects of slave rebellions, the forces that brought them together, the cohesion and the solidarity that brought in freedmen and people of different ethnic and religious backgrounds together, is because cohesion and solidarity remain vital to modern movements. If you look at BLM and Antifa, where you see them working is where you see people of different backgrounds, different temperaments, and different ideologies coming together with common goal. Where you see them starting to fall apart, where you start seeing otherism and nasty weird stuff, is where you see solidarity breaking down, or cohesion at the cost of solidarity, or where you see people otherizing cohesive factors within a movement. My favorite example as a hardcore leftist is those who would look at labor issues and issues of, say, LGBT rights and say, why is the gay agenda important if workers' rights are still such a huge issue, and you could scoop up a whole bunch of conservatives on the workers' rights issue who would probably be turned off entirely by the inclusion of the LGBT movement under our collective umbrella. And my answers to that would be cohesion and solidarity. Workers' issues aren't exclusive to LGBT issues. Quite the opposite. Workers' issues affect more than just straight white working class men. They affect everybody. Men and women who work in offices get their wages stolen just as easily as people who work on the ground floor. This is why it's important not to cut out people targeted by the same system as us. If the powers that be can separate the LGBT from the workers' rights, from the women's rights, then they can isolate us and pick us off one group at a time. You see this in Texas and in Florida, where because going after adult gays ain't so easy, they're going after young LGBT people. Because if they can isolate one group, if they can target some of us, then they can start taking us out one group at a time. If we turn our backs on the causes of those less fortunate than us, of our neighbors, of our family, then we open ourselves up to institutions just as vile, if not more so, than the slavery of the past. People like to say that evil thrives where good men do nothing. I forget entirely where that quote comes from because I'm a massive ignoramus, and even though it has been stamped on half of everything I've ever seen in my life, it feels like I never paid enough attention. But to some extent, it's true. If you do nothing, if you choose your own safety and comfort over the comfort of your neighbor, of your family, then you leave yourself open and your neighbor open to being singled out, targeted, eliminated one by one. Having your perspective erased is just as easy and just as probable as it is for a person of color, for a person of Islamic faith, for a woman, or for a person who is LGBT. It's just a matter of when that comes to you. There's a reason why people forget about slave rebellions. I mentioned it earlier, but the long and the short of it is it doesn't benefit oppressors for people to realize the people that they oppress fight back. They erase that history. They erase the culture of people who fight back. There's a reason why there's almost no Islamic presence in Brazil. There are Muslims in Brazil, but most of them immigrated there in the 20th century, rather than being the descendants of Muslims who lived there before. That's because over centuries, the Islamic faith was slowly erased. Slowly, over decades and decades. I guess what I'm trying to say with this one here is stop letting people erase the history of slave rebellions. The little acts, the big acts, the identity of people who fought back against slavery. Don't be Kanye West and his terrible take on why people remained enslaved. If you don't know what I'm talking about, bless your soul. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in a couple of weeks, hopefully, with another video for Women's History Month, when I'll talk about women. It's a very exciting topic, for me especially. I never touch the women's. I barely see the women's. The women's are distant and alien to me. I am so sad and lonely. Ever since my whammon abandoned me. You totally can't hear her laughing behind the camera right now. Anyway, thanks for sitting through it. Y'all stay safe. Subscribe, I guess. Subscribe! Okay, we're done.